So let's continue the Experian Innovation Summit 2025. We have had Andy Rich, Shell Deep on stage, and after that, a really great presentation discussion between Bjarne Corydon and Andy Wolf. So that was really exciting. And the next presenter is also extremely exciting. It's Pia Vollmester, who is a partner at the Kromann Reumert, and she will speak about the very interesting topic around how do we actually deal with the regulatory challenges that we see when we speak about innovation? Is it holding back innovation? And what is it actually doing to innovation? And is there a difference between our region versus the US or China or any other markets? And how can we actually stay compliant without slowing down that progress? But before I get Pia on stage, I need you to get your mobiles out again, because there's a question for you that we want to find out. And you can see it on the screens up here. Which area of regulation do you find most challenging to navigate? So there's a few options here: data protection, GDPR, AI and machine learning compliance, financial and credit regulation, the cybersecurity rules, or the consumer protection. So that is going to be interesting. Looks like our good old friend GDPR is leading. Yeah. Still in front. It looks like we have, unless something drastically are going to change now, we will have a winner. And it's called GDPR, our very good friend. Yeah, that's the conclusion. That's the one that you find the most challenging to navigate in. So maybe we can hear something about that, because I'm happy to introduce on stage Pia Vollmester. Give her a big hand. Thank you.
Thank you, Bo, for the very kind introduction. I'm indeed very honored to be such a trusted advisor that I solve everything in 30 minutes. Might be a little bit misleading marketing, however. All right, we're going to dive in, and I thought the poll was very interesting, and it's also the red thread going through what I'm going to say. If only the clicker would work with me. Now it does. Thank you. First of all, one could say, don't ask a lawyer if regulation is overwhelming, because that's what we do for a living. Having said that, as a slight reservation, I would say it is indeed very overwhelming. And unfortunately, the message is that it will keep coming. So we are flooded, and we will continue flooded, and we need to find a way through all of this. We had the best intentions when we started, and that's way back, even before the GDPR. We had regulation, but it's just kept emerging. And there's this saying that the US innovates, the EU regulates, and then in a parenthesis, China duplicates. I was in China recently, and I have to say that they're not duplicating anymore. They're very well off on their own. So very soon, maybe we will be duplicating a little bit. But secondly, if we zoom in on the regulation, and in particular the financial sector, I would say US is the mother of all regulation. So even though we find it very burdensome, it's only half of the truth. We are slowly getting into the same pace as they have been working in for many decades. And even though we have a lot of people in the private sector every day going to work trying to handle bureaucracy, it's fair to say that in the same comparable sectors in the US, they do the same, and the numbers are even higher. I think the overall difference is that when we move into the digital regulation, Europe is at the forefront indeed. And when we look at GDPR, the bad boy in the class, we are, of course, also way ahead of at least the US and also most of the part of the world that we usually compare ourselves with. I'm not too sure where the US is at these days. I think that was also an underlying message in the previous talk. Nobody knows. There's a Trump factor that nobody can control. It might ease up some of the burdens. It might also rub off on Europe, and I'll get back to that a little later when I wind up. This is just an overview, and I want to say already now I'm not going to go into the details, so don't worry. We're not traveling through all the regulation in the next 25 minutes, but just to give you an idea, and it's more or less the same topics that you were voting just before, but we have some regulation on an organizational level concerning cybersecurity. There's a lot going on these days about the AI and the AI Act. It didn't come out with high numbers, probably because the rules are not, at least all of them, in force yet, but it's also something that we need to deal with in the very close future. There's some regulation on the products and indeed also on the platforms. Some of you maybe read that the Irish Data Protection Agency, in fact, just fined on part of that, and the EU Commission as well on the DMA, Meta and Apple was up for big fines, so it's getting into play as well. And then there's the open data part, which Thomas will take on later. But that's the most recent initiative, the FIDA, the Financial Data Act, which is of course calling for to be the center of attention in that particular sector. But overall, we have a lot of regulations right now coming up or coming into force on the interoperability between the Internet of Things, the sharing of data in many sectors, the access to the data, to remove barriers. In fact, it's a competition regulation, so it works a little bit counterintuitive to the other rules. And not to take too much air out of this, it's very briefly, it's a data sharing regulation to ensure better access across the sector and essentially to ensure that the consumers can in fact get the most favorable loans and financing in general. And for that purpose, you have to share data, of course, on fair terms. And we'll also get back to what you need to consider on top of that. But there's a lot of building blocks to this, the Data Act, the Data Governance Act, and in the middle, the FIDA. And then we have sort of a headache in Denmark these days about our financial regulation, because in essence, everything that has to do with the customer is subject to financial confidentiality. So it's not shareable. And that is, it's a little bit counterintuitive to what the FIDA is working to obtain. The scope of the FIDA, this is just a legal overview, really not something to delve into. There's obligations to provide information. There's some responsibilities that has to do with how the data is processed, the security, which also sort of interacts with the GDPR, of course. And then there's the financial sharing arrangements, which my guess is that's going to take up most of the attention, at least for all of you in this room, how to do it, how much and when and where. And then there's a little bit about the service providers. That's a new group introduced in this regulation. And of course, we see supervision authorities. So it contains a little bit of everything. But underneath all of this, and going back to the poll, the GDPR is still playing a very active role. So FIDA is not going to offer a legal basis to actually share, disclose, collect data. That part we still have to find in the GDPR. So we'll not get rid of that, at least not in a near future. Then turning to the state of play in 2025, where are we at? And now I'm slowly turning towards the GDPR. As I said, it applies alongside all the other rules, and it is one of the most burdensome regulations that has come out of Europe in at least recent years. There was a report, as you probably are well aware, saying we need to enhance competitiveness, and that means that we also need to simplify the GDPR because it has been fragmented in the implementation. It doesn't undermine the digital goals. That's not a big surprise to anyone who has worked in this area, because that's not the purpose of the rules. So clearly it's not enhancing the possibility to actually be digitally competitive with, in particular, the US, but also China. So the Draghi report stated in September 24, you need to go and simplify the GDPR. And it brought, of course, a lot of happiness, and some was sighing with relief because now it's all over. We had the Danish Minister for Digital Affairs going out in the media very recently saying, I want to simplify the rules. That's great. She's not here today, I understand. So let me just translate. She cannot. It's a European regulation. So of course we can bring a vote to the table saying we want to simplify. But we also did that back in the days when the GDPR was adopted, and with very little success, I have to admit. So maybe times are changing, maybe it's getting a little better, but it's not for her to decide, so don't keep your hopes high. This is another very distinguished gentleman. He's like the godfather of GDPR. He was the director responsible for fundamental rights and union citizenship at the time when the GDPR was first drafted. He was actually leading the reform, and he doesn't have any pity in you. He thinks it's just the way it is, and really businesses must pay close attention and make sure that it's a safe environment and that data is not spread in every processing activity. So that is sort of the counterway to what the Danish minister is saying. And we don't have the votes out yet, so we don't know who's going to win this battle. But I have heard quite a lot of times recently that now we don't need to bother about the GDPR because very soon it will be gone and everything is fine and we can move on, and we still have to pay attention to the digital regulation, to the FIDA, etc. But GDPR over and done with. And that, of course, would in some at least aspects be very nice, because innovation and GDPR are probably more of polar opposites than they are opposites attracted to each other. So the message is not that we can solve it. Even had you given me the rest of the afternoon, I wouldn't be able to do that for you. But I think we need to embrace it and at least sort of weigh in and work with it as part of our competitive offer to the market. It's for sure going to stay, and we then have to, of course, find the right balance. We are not there yet, I think that's fair to say, and using it as a competitive parameter. I've been saying that since 2018. It's very easy for me as an advisor. It is, in fact, possible in some aspects, but that's not how it feels in everyday work, and I fully understand that. So, what will happen? We know a little bit now because the omnibus is running, as you know. GDPR was not part of it to begin with. Now, on the fourth omnibus, it has been invited to be a member of the simplifying actions coming out of the EU. We have seen the proposed amendments, and they have been commented even by the European regulators in the field of the GDPR. And I think it's fair to say that the adjustments are very, very minor. They relate to small and mid-sized companies. So you need to be at a very low turnover. You need to be less than 50 employees. I don't know how many of you feel that you're in zone for that. But for most, it's not going to have a big effect. There's some changes also to processing of sensitive data that you are obliged to process under law, that it's mandatory. That doesn't really affect many either. So in essence, I would say from what we have seen until now, the state of play in reality remains unaffected. Macro-wise, the path that was drawn up back in 2018, the path that was continued and that we see now in all the digital regulation is maintained. So we will not get off easier, unfortunately, in the future than we did in the past. And at a micro level, the best to do is, of course, to try to use it as a parameter, as I said, for competition. The second best would be to implement structures, organizational measures that in fact handle this in a way so that it's not going to stop development, it's not going to stop business, rather than letting compliance take over the entire business. Try to build in structures that can work across all the regulation. At least that's what we're trying to do these days, because there's a lot of similarities. Even going into the feeder, there's a lot of things we have seen before. Looking right now mostly at the AI, which is a big concern, the AI Act, there's a lot of mechanisms, documentation requirements, etc., that go very well hand in hand with what hopefully you already have in the area of the GDPR. So rather than inventing new compliance tracks, more compliance colleagues, try to sort of bundle and find a common path through. That's at least, in our experience, the best you can do. So not solving very much, but unfortunately, I'm afraid, but sending the message that it is doable. We have seen it done, but of course, it takes a little bit of muscle to get there.
Thank you, Pia. Thank you very much for that. Great presentation. Yeah, I don't know what to say, Pia, because
I'm sorry.
I really hoped that you came, with the solution today.
Yeah.
But not a big surprise. But going a little bit back to what you said, how do you think, and I know it's a really, really difficult question, but how do you think we can find a better balance towards regulation and doing our business? Because just looking at our own business, then you get, something called DORA, and it's like, it's a good intention and all that, and suddenly it explodes. You sit in numerous meetings, nobody knows what to do, and how do we find that balance?
Yeah, frustration is your new best colleague.
You could say that.
No,
yeah.
no. Joke aside, as I said, it is possible. I think that the mistake made most frequently is that you invent new roles for new regulation rather than letting the compliance team you have absorbing the regulation that comes and drawing a pattern that covers all the regulations. So if you hire a new AI compliance dude and a new DORA and a new it will continue feeder, whatever comes next, then it's going to kill you. But if you, as I said, embrace it, rethink your governance structures, essentially. It's much more about the governance than it is about the rules. It's much more about procedures, running it schedulized, than it is inventing new roles in the business. So taking the frustration out of the business, because the business shouldn't be working with compliance, keeping it inside the compliance organization, but of course also slowly interacting. Compliance needs to understand the real world, meaning the business, otherwise it's not going to fly. The business, of course, needs to absorb at least that there is a lot of rules now overwhelming and also to some extent steering the way. But that would be my best advice.
Embrace DORA. Yeah,
Also DORA.
Also DORA, yeah, not only DORA. But
No.
it's a good advice. Is there anything around, at least in the Danish market, we have been speaking about over-implementation, that we're doing way too much. What's your thoughts about that?
Well, it depends, because there's so many rules. In some areas, I think it's fair to say that we are over-implementing, but looking at the state of play and also what now will come out of Omnibus 4, I think we have to finally take it in and say, no, we're not over-implementing. It is very rigid. It is very un-Danish, probably very un-Nordic way of thinking about things. It's more like the US. I've been working with American authorities for decades, and they are, believe it or not, even worse than what we see in Europe. So we're not over-implementing, but we haven't found the right way to structure the task that we are given by the rules.
And another question, it might, be a little bit of a stupid question, but I'll take a chance anyway. Because from what I've heard, you said, there is no difference between the US, EU, etc., regulation. But why is it then that, you see EU handing out big fines to some of the big fintech companies in the US? Why is that?
Well, that's a matter of who's controlling who.
Okay.
And when they have activity on the European part of the European continent, then it is for the European regulators to fine them. In the same way as we have seen, actually, the US financial authorities fining European companies for decades if they have a branch, affiliate office, and they step outside the path. Money laundering is a very good example, and fines also coming from the US regulators. So it's not different. But the big difference is the US didn't regulate the digitalization in the same to the same extent as we have been doing. And so that's at least what we think is holding us back. I don't want to slap anyone in the face, but I think it's also a little bit about the European not fatigue, but comfortness in believing that the US companies, tech companies in particular, will provide all the progress we need. And that was the belief to begin with. And at some point, some of the politicians woke up and said, oh, we need a European Silicon Valley. It was just way too late. And I don't think we will get there, not with regulation or without regulation, because this is how the landscape is now, and we need to essentially embrace that.
But my last question to you, because you're speaking about, embracing and, use the opportunity, and I think that's totally right. But is there any specific regulation that you can see and where you believe it's actually hindering the technical progress, and is there any way to address that?
I think the poll was quite right, and the perception is in line with what we see in our everyday work. GDPR is really tricky for you. Of course, the financial regulation is indeed also very complex, and it's not always a European standard, it's national standards, which probably is even worse than the hard rocks coming out of Europe. So that is, I would say, of course, part of at least the explanation, that we have numerous regulations and legislations competing to be the worst to overcome. And unfortunately, as I said, I'm afraid it's going to stay that way.
So let's leave it at that, Pia. A big round of applause for Pia Vollmester for a look into